Tonight, I know we advertised as Musaf Part 3 and Shabbos Morning Part 17, 18, Shabbos Year number 83, whatever it is. But something happened on the way to the Coliseum. So about an hour and a half ago, maybe 2 hours ago, it was so strange. I was outside of my house. My wife just came back from coming back from work and picking up my daughters from their camp bus stop. And they brought Slurpees from 7-Eleven. So I'm outside with my wife and we're eating Slurpees and we're talking to a new gardener that we hired. And all of a sudden we notice this little puppy walking down McLaughlin. And for those who aren't familiar, McLaughlin is not a very safe street for humans to walk down. Maybe it used to be 10 years ago, but now with Waze and Google Maps, it's absolutely awful. A big problem, a discussion for a different time. I actually met with the Department of Transportation of New York State, together with our representative in Albany, Assemblyman Wepper, trying to fix this problem. It's a serious problem for those that live on McLaughlin. In any event, this dog was not going to live. I mean, there was no way. So Nechama ran down to the side of the street with this little puppy. It was a little puppy. And she sees it has no collar, nothing, no identification marks. So I quickly ran, and it's like 90 degrees and humid. So I ran inside, I got a bowl of water, and my kids came out and we carried it up and we fed the dog. And so I told Nechama, I have to have a shear tonight. I got to prepare for the shear. So I come to the office and I'm calling Nechama constantly, what's going on with the dog. So they finally decided, so, I put it on the Minyan chat. I put it on a few other chats. Nechama put on her chats. We spoke to some of our non-Jewish neighbors. Does anybody know anybody that has a dog that looks like this? It looks almost like a cockapoo, if you're familiar with breeds. In any event, so Nechama had a little bit of an epiphany. So her and the kids decided, let's put the dog down on the street and we'll follow the dog. Let's see where the dog goes. And eventually that led her to the dog's house on Sancho, somewhere somewhat, like a 6-minute walk from our house. I have to say that my kids, especially my youngest, Hadassah and Asana, were greatly disappointed that the owner was found, because for many, many years, they've been pleading with me to buy a dog. And this was that's why I kept calling Nechama for updates, because please, my God, find this owner, because I don't want to have to care for this dog for the future. That's for certain. That got me thinking, as I'm sitting here, we've talked about, the subject has come up. It's come up in the laws of Muktzah. It's come up in a few other areas talking about shul. And I figured maybe tonight's the night that we give a taste of really the true purpose of this class, which is purely halachic, and give people a basic background of pets in halacha in general, but more in particular, pets on Shabbos. This is a sensitive topic, and I want to tell you just how sensitive it is. And, because sometimes I put these classes on YouTube, so maybe I'll edit it. I just actually downloaded today an editing software so I can make my videos more professional. Maybe I'll edit this out. But if not, my apologies to my magazine. It's so controversial. So when I was growing up, it was almost unheard of for a frum family to have a pet. I always knew a few. It wasn't very common. I shouldn't say it was unheard of. It wasn't very common. Today, when I go to Muncie for a Shabbos, for example, a black hat neighborhood, I would say at least 20% of people have dogs. And I see them walking them on Shabbos. And this is a complete shift of what I'm used to. And not only that, but it affects halacha in many ways. So you all know me enough. I'm not a machmir. I'm not stringent in any way in halacha. Everything that I'm going to tell you tonight is basic halacha. I will share with you, when we talk about the halachas of pets tonight, in general, we're going to talk about pets in general, and then bring it to Shabbos. Of course, the majority of you talking about Shabbos. I will tell you when there are those who disagree with me. So with that, I apologize that it's a little bit different than what we were planning on talking about, but nevertheless, that's what we're going to talk about. So first of all, I want to point out there's a difference between pets, and we'll see that a little bit more in a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes or so. Whether it's a dog, a cat, whether it's a parrot. It's actually very interesting that the New York Times, we're coming off of July 4th, and I sent out this article to the shul that I mentioned in passing by Hilchos Shabbos, how the Rambam on the Mayflower was studied. Without going into that, for those who didn't see the email, you can take a look at the email. Interestingly, relating to Thanksgiving, which is somewhat related to July 4th, the Atlantic magazine, there's a question in etymology why it is, we may have talked about this on various Thanksgiving shiurim, why it is that the word for turkey seems to always imitate the word for either the country of Turkey or the country of India. So in Hebrew, it's Hodu, which is, what's Hodu? What country in modern Hebrew is Hodu talking about?
India.
Isn't that weird? And in Yiddish, it's Indic, which is India. And in English, it's Turkey. And I've done this Google search, and you can do it too. Choose a language and then put in Turkey, and then put in the country of Turkey or India. It's going to be one or the other. So this is a fascinating history, and actually relates to halacha, and we've given classes on this Thanksgiving time. I'm not going to go through it now, but so there's a letter to the editor that the Atlantic magazine published in 2012. So I'm going to read you the letter, or the article in the Atlantic that quotes the letter to the editor. Quote, in the early 1990s, a debate broke out in the letter to the editor section of the New York Times over the possible Hebrew origins for the word turkey. On December 13th, 1992, someone suggested that the New World fowl, which is really what it was called, because remember, turkey was unheard of in Europe until the conquistadors brought them over. Anyway, the New World fowl received its English name from Christopher Columbus's interpreter, Louis de Torres. By the way, Louis de Torres was the only proven Jew on the ship with Columbus. People like to say Columbus was a Jew. I have to just say, I don't buy it. I saw all the evidence. Don't send me the Jewish press articles and etc. I've seen it all. He was not Jewish. At least there's no evidence. But the Torres was. In fact, there's a Reformed temple in the Caribbean named after him, Ade Yom Hazeh, until this day. Anyway, he was, by the way, a Jewish convert to Catholicism. Because remember, being Jewish in Spain was not unique. Spain had a tremendously large Jewish population. Being Jewish and not converting to Catholicism, that was unique, and he did not pass that test. Anyway, in an October, I'm going to continue to read. In an October 12, 1492 letter from de Torres to a friend living in Spain, de Torres had referred to the American bird. So he sees for the first time a turkey, and what does he call it? He calls it a tuki. In Chazal, a tuki usually refers to a parrot. Some, depending if you're looking at art scrolls from Sino or another translation, some translate it as a peacock. It's quite fascinating. Even the names chosen in Hebrew for the pets that we have or the animals that we eat are quite fascinating. But I could talk about a lot about the Hebrew etymology of the different animals, but I don't want to take too much time. I want to get into the halacha. So let me, I just move my notes here for a second. My father-in-law, so let's get into the halacha topic. I want to bring us to Shabbos. My father-in-law always wanted to be a veterinarian. That was his dream as a little boy. And when he was in Kollel in Montreal, he started to, I'm assuming, he took pre-vet classes. But because he had to take all this chemistry and science, and he was learning in Kollel, the MK, Montreal Kosher, hired him because he knew so much about chemistry. They figured he'll be great to work. And of course, he was fantastic. And eventually he was hired by the COR. So, my kids all inherited that Yerusha. The Taubes don't have the animal gene, not even a little bit. But it's interesting to note that, a lot of people, myself included, make fun of Jews who own pets and say this is not really a Jewish character trait. And that's not true. The Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, this is, if you want to look it up, it's in Choshe Mishpat, Siman Tuf Tes. They both make it clear that owning pets goes back many, many centuries. In fact, this is going to amaze you. There's a medrash, if you want to look it up, in Bereshis Rabbah, Ayin Gimel Yud Aleph states that Yaakov owned over 1 million dogs. Now, dogs in particular, domesticated dogs, there's a lot to talk about dogs. I mean, I wish I had a few hours to talk about the various pets, but one thing is certain, that dogs have always been domesticated since the giving of the Torah, and even prior to that, by Jews. In Europe, especially after 1933, many Jews, especially Almanos, who lived alone, would own German Shepherds and own very strong dogs. In fact, the Mashgiach in Telz Yeshiva, Zalman Weiss, since retired, there's a new Mashgiach, but last year when he was the Mashgiach, Zalman Weiss told me that his great-grandmother in Europe had a pet dog as a means of protection. And it was amazing because whenever she would recite Tehillim, the dog would always leave the room. It was like this great nace that everybody in the village talked about, that she had it for protection because she lived alone, but she used to read Tehillim. Whenever she opened the Tehillim, the dog would leave the room. There are other great stories about dogs, but I don't want to take too much of your time. But I do want to share how ancient pets go, because the reason why I want to spend time on this is, I'm going to quote Gemaras, and a constant mistake people make is, oh, that's from 2,000 years ago. What did they know about our embracing of owning pets? Well, it goes back beyond the Greek and the Roman era. So I want to read to you, I found this a few years ago when I was researching this topic. I always research this topic just to convince the Chama not to buy a dog. But in any event, I found the Greek headstone. Listen to this. This is a headstone in the cemetery in Greece. This is a translation. The white Maltese dog Emilius, meaning this is a pet cemetery. It's actually a human cemetery where a pet was buried. Faithful guardian, they called him Bull while he still lived, but now the silent paths of night possess his voice. An imperfect translation from the Greek, but that's what it says. And it's funny. First of all, it's important to know how far back dogs go. In fact, the Chumash says, right, when you have treif and avela, you feed it to a dog. And the Chazal tell us about, or the Pasuk tells us, that you can't use the money purchased for a dog for a karban. I mean, in the Torah itself, it's not even a medrash. In the Torah itself, the idea of a dog, I'll share with you a few more points. Again, this is just to demonstrate that the concept of owning pet animals, specifically dogs, is by no means new. So I'll give you a few other examples. Well, first, let me tell you,
Rabbi, Pesach when the dogs didn't bark.
Pesach when the dogs didn't bark, which is one of the reasons why we give them that, but the treif and avela. So, because there are very interesting shilas today. And I have to say this, and again, I know this, we want to talk about the halacha, and at the rate we're going, maybe we'll have a part two, but this is so important to recognize. Again, so many people, we always think we live in modern times, but every single one of us, I don't mean to depress you, live in some distant future's past. We don't live in modern times. Ein davar chadash tachas hashamash. I always love repeating the story of in Buffalo, New York, the first Rebbe is buried. The first Rebbe in America, Rabbi Rabinovich. And you could actually go to Bard Park. There are buses like once a month that go to Buffalo to his kever. It became very popular, even in the Litvish world, to daven by his kever. So our shul in Buffalo, the previous shul, they would collect any material they could find in Rabbi Rabinovich because people would come and would want to know. So I used to, and I'm a Kayan, so I couldn't go to the kever, so I would research a lot. So there was a newspaper called the American Hebrew. The American Hebrew was like the Jewish press of the time. And there were sections for the various Jewish communities. And Buffalo, in 1910 was pretty big. MGM had a movie studio there a few years later. I mean, it was the World Fair where McKinley was assassinated. Buffalo used to be, not anymore, but it used to be a big city. So there was a Buffalo section, and it discusses Rabbi Rabinovich, this Rebbe who came, the first Rebbe in America, and how he died in Buffalo. So Dick Berger, the president of the shul, shows me that he found this. I'm like, this is amazing. And I said, let me look at the rest of the page because, okay, we got it, Rabbi Rabinovich. But what is the rest of Buffalo news? And I'll never forget this. I think I shared this, by the way, my first Shabbos in Holliswood. I shared this story. I'm going to tell you now. Nobody remembers it, so it must have not left much of an impression, but it left an impression on me. So I look at the entry below it. I still remember the name. Frederick Allman will be giving a class on 14 Delaware Avenue, November 15th, 1911. Topic, the early Jews of Buffalo, New York. And whenever you say that before a live audience, they always laugh. Didn't he know that he was an early Jew of Buffalo, New York? Of course he didn't know. Nobody views themselves as the early Jew of. It's such a mussar that in 1911, he gave a shmooze, a class on the early Jews of Buffalo, because everybody believes they live in modern times. So when you want to adjudicate halacha, you have to get out of that mindset that you live in modern times. You look at pictures of yourself or your parents in the 70s with their collars going to here. They also thought they lived in modern times and had figured it out. So just to demonstrate pets and modern times, in 1958, Max and Jane Salter, they lived in Beverly Hills. They had a black Cocker Spaniel named Windy. They were the first ones to make a bark mitzvah. Now you think, it's a funny story. It's becoming so popular now that years ago I was researching this and I found on a rabbinic symposium, it turned out to be conservative, but nevertheless, they wanted to discuss Jewish pets in Jewish law. And I thought they were going to discuss, what's the conservative position on pets on Shabbos. Instead, they enter this fantasy land discussion, which is worse than Purim Torah. They discuss how does a Rav make a Misha Berach for someone's pets on Shabbos? Like, how do you announce the pet in shul? Should it be together with the humans? Should it be a separate Misha Berach? How do you perform as a Rav a pet levaya? And it gave you instructions how to give a pet levaya. What bracha should a rabbi say when a pet comes to shul for the first time? This is not a joke. By the way, it is asur, forbidden to bring a pet into a Beis HaKnesses, which probably means it's mutter to bring it into conservative sanctuary. I don't care if you're angry at me for saying that. I say it nonetheless. I take my religion very seriously. If they would too, I wouldn't say such lines. It's horrible, horrible. Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva about someone who was blind and he had a seeing eye dog. And what did he do? He wrote to Moshe Feinstein, even though it's forbidden to bring a dog into shul, could I bring a dog into shul? We've sacrificed for halacha, and people who treat halacha like a Mickey Mouse carnival gets me very, very upset. Very upset. And speaking about Mishaberachs for dogs, there's a great story that Rabbi Yankel Gulinsky, the great Maggid, says, because what do you do? Because if you're a rabbi, it may happen that someone's going to come to you and say, Rabbi, my pet's sick. I've had that happen. And by the way, that's not a small thing. A pet being sick is a serious thing. One of the reasons I don't want to own pets is because owning a pet is countdown to tragedy. You're going to have to bury that one day. It's very depressing, and you fall in love with your pet. So I'm not minimizing it at all. I just had a shiloh this week, someone in the community who had a whole shiloh about putting down a pet. I'm not belittling that. What I am belittling is putting them at the level of human beings. I don't want to be mistaken. So Reb Shach, so Reb Galinsky repeats the story how Reb Shach, the Shiva Panovich, got into a cab. And if you want to look it up, it's Reb Galinsky on Parshas Ve'era. Anyway, so Reb Shach gets into a cab, and they're driving, and the taxi driver looks behind him and sees he is the Shiva Panovich. Reb Shach in Eretz Yisrael was known even by Chilonim. So the Chiloni taxi driver says, my dog's very sick, Rosh Hashiva. Could Rosh Hashiva maybe make a Mishaberach for my dog? So Shach says, of course. Okay, what's your dog's name? Rusty. Great. Rusty Ben. What's her mother's name? His mother's name? Well, I don't know his mother's name. Well, you don't know his mother's name? Maybe Mishaberachs then should be saved for humans. That's how he got out of it. He started doing the real thing. And then when he asked the mother's name, he didn't know. He said, you know what? Because you don't know the mother's name, we shouldn't do it. By the way, between us, if you don't know it by a human being, if you don't know the mother's name, you can still say Misha Berach. But for a dog, maybe not. I'm not saying you can't daven for your dog to be better. Just don't put it in the same category as humans. Now, you may think that I'm being a little bit too picky by saying don't put it in the same category as humans. But again, I'm only saying this because before we get to the halacha, I want to put you in the halachic mindset. I want to share my screen for a moment and show you something, which I find very scary. And several years ago, my Shabbos Shuvah drasha was about happiness. And it's one of my favorite Shabbos Shuvah drashas I ever gave. I don't remember why this came up, but I remember it did. So I'm going to share my screen. And I want to show you. There we go. So if you can see this. This is a diagram. If you had a choice between your dog or a dog and saving either a foreign tourist, a hometown stranger, a distant cousin, a best friend, a grandparent, or a sibling. Okay, I want just to demonstrate, if you thought I was being a little bit too mean, this is why. Look at this diagram, how sick of an environment that we live in, how poisoned of a culture we have. So just if you don't understand it, if it's your dog, between your dog and a foreign tourist, it's like a 30% difference. It only combines, the tie goes to if it's if it's your dog and a sibling and your dog is pretty much tied. This is, by the way, not from, I wonder if I say where it is. So here you have the actual statistics. Do I say where it's from? This is my own notes. So let me just see. You can see it's my own notes because I didn't fix the spelling here. Do I say where this is from? Here we go. A study presented its participants with the following dilemma. If a car were to be speeding toward a dog and a human, and one has time to save only one, which would they choose? Many chose the animal. So this is from, would you save a puppy or a child from a burning building? A new study shows Psychology Today. I'm not a big, Psychology Today is the art scroll of the psychological world. Don't get me wrong. This is not like, but I remember reading it and they had sources. You can look it up. I have it's obviously a popular magazine, not academic. As I said, it's like the art scroll, which is wonderful, but it's not the academic, but they brought a source. So let me stop the share. So maybe now you could better understand why I'm stressing this. And by the way, when we talk about abortion on Shabbos, it's the same thing. I mean, it's very hard to remove yourself from culture, left, right, or center, and view things vanilla, to start fresh and view things be'enei haTorah, through the eyes of the Torah, which is our goal in life. Anyway, okay, so now finally, 30 minutes, almost 30 minutes in, we could talk about a little bit of Hilchos Shabbos. and pets. So there is an entire, first of all, we say it in let's open up with the siddur, because we're holding by the siddur. So if you happen to have a siddur in front of you, the first item about pets on Shabbos comes from the siddur. So if you open up to page 492 in the art scroll, Zachar es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho, we all know this phrase. Sheishes Yom Ta'avot, for 6 days you should work. V'asisa kol malachtecha, you could do all creative labor. V'yom HaShvi Shabbos LaHashem Elokecha, but the 7 days for God. Lo sa'aseh kol malacha, you should not do any labor. Ata, you, Vincha, your sons, Ubitecha, your daughters, Avdecha, your butlers, Va'amasacha, your female butlers, Uvehemtecha, and even your animals. We say this every week. So right off the bat, we discover that the 39 malachos that we didn't even get to yet apply to us and apply to our animals. So now you should believe me, because you say it every week. I want to repeat what I just said. The 39 creative labors of Shabbos apply to us and apply to our animals. We say this every Shabbos. Now, in what way does it apply to our animals? You know, if you see an ant in your house carrying a load and the Erev is down, you don't have to run to the Rav's house and ask a shaila. So we'll see what does that even mean? But isn't it amazing that you could go through life saying this every week? What in the world are we talking about? Uvehemtecha, our animals? What does that even mean? This is why this 37-year Shabbos weekly class that we're doing this, but it's so important to understand what this means. So a little bit at a time. We're going to have to do a part 2. I just see the time. We'll go 10, 15 more minutes, but we'll have a part 2 next week about animals on Shabbos, and then we'll continue with Musaf. Don't worry. I don't want to spend too long on animals. So let's talk a little bit about it. So there's an entire parak. You may think this is a stringency in the Shulchan Aruch, the Rishonim. There's a parak, a chapter of Mishnayos in Masechta Shabbos, all about animals on Shabbos. Animals are not allowed to carry without an eruv. If you own a pet, you cannot have your animal go out in items that it doesn't need on Shabbos. I mean, this is how serious this is. I don't know how much detail we could go into. What I will tell you is, if you want to buy a pet, either never tell the rabbi or make a meeting with the rabbi. It's one or the other. You can't have it in the middle. Maybe I always say the story where someone, I probably say this every week, someone came to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky with a very complicated dessert, and he asked them, what bracha do you make on it? And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky said, a very quiet one. So owning a pet might be something you don't want to go to the rabbi about. On Pesach, let's start very simply, because we only have about 10 more minutes. I don't want to take more than 40, 45 minutes each week. Here's something very easy to shoehorn you in, something that everybody knows a little bit, because there's a lot we don't know, but here's what most people do know, which is about feeding animals. It is absolutely forbidden to feed animals on Shabbos. That's it. There's no debate about this. There's no discussion. There's no, until, the 17th century, they used to always allow it. If you look at pictures in Poland, they used to say, no, it's a Gemara. You cannot feed animals on Shabbos unless it relies on you for sustenance. Okay? So the classic example, I know I spoke about this several years ago on Rosh Hashanah or in a pre-Rosh Hashanah shir, this idea, and I'm sure everybody knows this by now. I hope everybody knows this by now. This idea that by Tashlich, we're supposed to throw bread into the water is not only not true, it's forbidden. It's absolutely forbidden on Rosh Hashanah. A few days after Rosh Hashanah, you could do Tashlich till day before Hoshana Rabbah, even on Hoshana Rabbah. If you want to throw it in, that's fine. But this idea that everybody thinks that's a part of Tashlich, not only is it not part of Tashlich, it's the day of judgment, and you're violating rabbinic law. Absolutely violating. And that's not biblical law, to be honest, it's rabbinic law, but violating rabbinic law nonetheless. However, if you want to understand, well, how could it be? Many of us may have memories of grandparents or parents doing this. I don't want you to think negatively of them. The reason why, now I don't know why this minhag started, because the idea that we're throwing away our sins, we're not Catholic, we're not Christian. You can't throw away your sins. I hate to break it to you. There's no vicarious atonement. And it certainly doesn't happen through bread. So what's really happening, so what might be happening, the reason why you have memories is the Chazon Ish and many others point out that if let's say you don't own birds, but every morning you go to Cunningham Park and you sit on bench 12 and you put out last night's crumbs, and the birds come and the seagulls come and the New York pigeons come, and they become accustomed to this. So then the poskim say if they rely on you, on the public for food, then you can feed them on Shabbos. So it could be that in Europe and certain places in New York, there are parks and ponds where the fish rely on the public for their food. So in that case, maybe according to some poskim, you could assume the role of the public. So I don't want to make it that your parents did anything wrong. There is what to rely on, but the basic halacha is you're not allowed to feed an animal that doesn't belong to you. Even more importantly, you're supposed to feed your animal good food, especially on Shabbos. I'll explain that more next week. But if you have a pet at home, you have to make sure before you make kiddush, that you fed your pet. It is absolutely forbidden, according to the laws of Tzar Baalei Chayim, that an owner of an animal should eat before their pet. So, last week we talked about when could you make kiddush, after Shachris, before Musaf, after Kriyas Torah, after Musaf. One thing is for certain, you cannot make kiddush until your fish and your animals are fed.
Thank you, Rabbi Tab.
Last week, we accidentally stumbled into a topic that would have been reserved for much later in the series on Hilchos Shabbos. We are in the midst of the Kloli de Shabbos, Muktzah, Mir La'akum, lighting candles, the meals, davening, eventually leading up to after Havdalah and Lav Malka. Then we're going to start the 39 Malachos. And that's really the meat and potatoes of this shir, or at least what really everybody needs to review at least 3-4 times in their lifetime. What makes this shir, I think, so important, for me included. And somewhere in there, probably by Tzeda, probably by the malach of trapping, as we'll discuss tonight why, we would have discussed pets. But as I mentioned last week, an event happened where there was a stray dog, and my family took it in for just 10 minutes, then went for a walk, and about an hour later found the owner. That brought to mind the topic of pets. So we talked about it last week. And the truth is we didn't really get into so much of Hilchos Shabbos. We talked about philosophically pets and other matters relating to them, other halachos relating to them, the history of owning pets. I want to continue, at least start with that theme tonight, and then move into Shabbos very quickly. So I don't think I mentioned this last week, but I always loved repeating this. Yiddishkeit has always taken Tzar Baalei Chayim very seriously. Animals are HaKadosh Baruch Hu's creatures, creations. We're not supposed to harm them. Even ripping up a blade of grass for no reason seems to go against the way we're supposed to think about the world, let alone a living creature. There's a discussion in Kabbalah if animals could go to heaven. There's a real discussion of what type of heaven they would have. They are on the higher level of Tzomeach. They're beyond living plant things. They're not humans, but in between the two. There's a Gemara that tells us, and someone, if I said this last week, please tell me. There's a Gemara that tells us how Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, of course, was the redactor of the Mishnah, and he suffered a good portion of his life. He was bitzar, he was in horrible pain, which to me, I always remember this Gemara because how could you accomplish writing the entire Mishnah while you're in pain? It just shows you his strength. He was also a very wealthy man. In any event, the Gemara asks, what did he do to deserve this pain? And the Gemara actually, even though really, how do we ever know what the reason is? But the Gemara had a tradition that it knew what his crime was. And his crime was, he was once walking and he passed by a beis shchita, a shlachtais, and there were cows lined up for the slaughter. And one of the cows, metaphorically, I guess, or maybe he knew how to communicate with animals, I'm not sure. One of the animals started to cry to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi to save me, I'm going to my slaughter. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's response was, Leich shelekach netzarta. Go to your slaughter, because that's why you were created. And in a sense, there's some truth to that, right? Because if everybody became vegetarians tomorrow, I've had many debates at my Shabbos table over the years with vegetarians, friendly debates. And one of the points I've made in years past is if we stopped eating meat, chickens and eggs will become vegans. Whose chickens will disappear from the planet? Cows will disappear from the planet. Certain animals will just disappear. So in a sense, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi was correct, but Chazal tell us this was a horrible thing to say because the truth is animals provide a lot of needs, right? So sheep provide clothing. Cows and animals of the farm provide help with farming up until, John Deere invented the tractor. So that was such an insensitive comment that he suffered for years. And in fact, another Gemara tells us it was only when he helped protect an animal did he get his health back. So everything we're about to say tonight is not to suggest that Chazal didn't take animals seriously. Quite the contrary. I remember once, I don't know if I've shared the story before, but when I was in Buffalo, so similar to our shul this year, which is the meeting point for the Al Haderech camp, which is a camp that takes kids on trips all over the United States. So whenever they come back to the city, this is their stopping point. So in Buffalo, our shul for NCSY of Western New York region, which is Albany, Rochester, Binghamton, Buffalo, our shul was the center. So many times on Friday, I would come to my shul, and there'll be kids, random kids, bus loads coming off of the bus. And I remember once I was going into my office, and there was a kid sitting at the front stoop, and he was playing a guitar. He wasn't wearing a yarmulke. He obviously was not yet from, which is really NCSY's mission. And I said, you play beautifully. He was playing the guitar. He goes, yeah, but I was told that I can't play it on Shabbat. I said, well, yeah, because, guitars, I tried to explain. And he said, well, as opposed to Judaism, I think music is very important. This was the argument of the initial reform. When the reform movement began, they felt, how could we not have music, various musical instruments on Shabbos like churches have? Music is important. And they made these changes. And of course, it was the death of all those Jews. And I explained to him, at least I tried to explain to him, it's quite the contrary. Judaism is the only religion that literally has musical notes under every letter of the Torah. Think about that for a second. We have musical notes under every letter of every pasuk, of every word in Tanakh, right? Asnachta, that's the only one I remember from Colin Weber. But in any event, I remember that one. No, Shalshelis, we know them all. But that's pretty amazing if you think about it. We're told that we're supposed to sing song when we learn Gemara. Zmiros, what other religion, when you're walking by at night from tables of families in 2022, do you hear singing, families singing together? Maybe on Christmas Eve. But other than that, only us. We love music. And in fact, it's our obsession with music that Chazal instituted certain precautions because it knows that if a musical instrument we'll be allowed to use it on Shabbos, we're going to start creating musical instruments, fixing musical instruments, doing specific types of dances, which could be a problem on Shabbos. So it's as opposed to what the initial reactionary response is that we're dry Litvaks, that old joke I always say. There was a Litvak who loved his wife so much he almost told her. That's not what these halachos are. It's really about our obsession with music. And so too, when it comes to pets. Because what I'm about to tell you, some people may become, come on, what did Chazal understand? But as hopefully we'll understand, it's because of how much Chazal understood that we are Rachmanim b'nei Rachmanim. We are merciful, coming from a tradition of mercy. And that's some of the reasons that some of these laws are created. Now, one last word of introduction. I know many of you have pets. I'm assuming, and I'm not coming tonight to tell you that anything you're doing is wrong, especially if you've inherited a tradition from your rebbeim or your parents. But I still think it's worthy, even if we're going to give leniencies, and we'll discuss certain leniencies to the halachas we're going to mention. These have to be said out loud. And Moshe Feinstein expressed this wonderfully when discussing the Erev of Manhattan in one of his many discussions of creating an Erev of Manhattan. He said that there has to be one major city, a city center that doesn't have an Erev. And this is not his main reason for not making an Erev in Manhattan, but listen to his point. I grew up without an Erev. If every community had and most kids today don't even know what the concept is not to be able to carry on Shabbos. It's almost as if there are 38 malachos. The idea of not carrying outside your house, people aren't even going to know it exists. So at the very least, let's know the basic halacha. Even if we think there are leniencies that apply to you and me, maybe yes, maybe no, you'll decide. You still have to be aware of the starting point, and that matters. That really matters in halacha, to know the starting point. So with this in mind, I'm going to share with you the following. In halacha, when it comes to Shabbos, there are two very specific prohibitions between you and pets. Now, last week we talked about feeding pets. That's already taken care of, right? You can't feed pets on Shabbos or animals on Shabbos unless they rely on you or it's a stray dog, like a starving animal. Unless it's going to suffer without you or it relies on you for food, other than that, you can't feed it. So that certainly allows us to feed pets and our fish on Shabbos. But I want to now speak more generally about the halachos of animals on Shabbos. So the first halacha, which actually was slightly referenced last week, is that just like you are prohibited from doing malacha, an animal is prohibited from doing malacha. So what does that mean? An animal could do whatever it wants for its own benefit. So let's say your landscaper didn't come and your pet dog is outside eating the grass. I don't know if dogs do that. You don't have to stop it. But you can't send it outside to do that. You can't send the animal outside to go to the bathroom and say our garden needs fertilizing anyway. That's absolutely forbidden. And most certainly, and the poskim discussed this, dogs know all these tricks. They're sit and to stand and to do all these different things. You cannot, it is biblically, we're not now talking about rabbinically. This is based on psukim in the Torah. So we're not even getting into the rabbinic muktzah just yet. Based on psukim in the Torah, it is forbidden to ask or make or hint to your dog to do a malacha for you on Shabbos. It's fascinating because you have a better time putting a baby in front of a light switch than your dog in front of a light switch. Without getting into philosophically and halachically why that is, that's just a matter of fact. So right off the bat, you have to be aware that an animal has to keep Shabbos like you keep Shabbos. Now, and again, when we say an animal is keeping Shabbos, we don't mean that it can't do malacha. Anything that's for your benefit, the animal cannot do, and you have to prevent it from doing. Very important to note. There are so many examples of this, but I don't have a pet, so I can't think of any on the top of my head. But just to be aware of that first halacha. The second halacha is, maybe there's three halachas. So the first one is I can't do malacha. That's biblical. The next two are rabbinical, but these are undisputed rabbinical laws. These come from Gemaras and Mishnayos. They are codified in the Shulchan Aruch. This is not some Tosfos, based on a Yerushalmi. These are straightforward Gemaras and in the Shulchan Aruch. You're not allowed to ride an animal on Shabbos. In fact, the Gemara says if by accident you got onto an animal, this doesn't really apply to pets because I don't know, unless you have like a big ostrich or a horse. There are from people who own stables. It doesn't really come up. But when the Gemara says what happens if someone gets onto a horse on Shabbos, halachically they also can't come off, but only because of tsar balei chayim, because really you should be now you have to just stay there the rest of Shabbos. It's moktzah to get on or off an animal. But because the animal's in pain, you could get off. I mean, just to show you how far these halachas go. Included in that prohibition is to put things on an animal. So this actually relates. You have a pet at home, if you have a funny looking hat, you want to put it on the pet. It is forbidden to do that. You're not allowed to place anything on an animal on Shabbos unless it's for the animal's own need. So I'll give you an example. In Los Angeles, you can see walking in the street little puppies with like suits on, like clothes, like a button-up jacket. That is absolutely usher on Shabbos, unless there's an eruv. But even then, it's problematic. A leash or something that's for the animal's need would be okay. A blanket, I mean, if an animal needs it, that's fine. But anything that's not needed for the animal, not only are you not allowed to mount an animal on Shabbos, you're also not allowed to place anything onto an animal on Shabbos. Okay, so that's its own category. We're not going to go into that category because there are many cases we could discuss even with home pets, but that's not even the main issue. Because the next issue is the main issue, and that is animals are muktzah on Shabbos. And this is the controversial one. When I say controversial, it's almost as rare as Hilchos Chol HaMoed that rabbis don't discuss. I don't know why. And I think it's a shame. On Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to do malacha, right? You're not allowed to go to work on Chol HaMoed. It's either daraisa, according to some opinions. At best, it's derabbanan. You're not allowed to work on Chol HaMoed. Now, are there ways around it? Of course. Listen, I'm a rabbi. I work on Shabbos. No, I'm not giving anybody musar. But rabbis rarely speak about this, probably because they're afraid nobody's going to listen. And, some rabbis maybe didn't have time to learn these halachas themselves because, how often do you get asked the shaila? And the other one, I think, is pets. So let's discuss it as mature adults. Let's go through this. As it's been a couple of years by now that we last discussed muktzah, so just a quick reminder of what muktzah is. Muktzah has nothing to do with electronics. When you're young, you associate muktzah with electronics. Obviously, electronics weren't invented when muktzah was invented. In fact, mishnayos weren't invented when muktzah was invented. Muktzah goes back to biblical times, to Sefer Nehemiah. It was Nehemiah in the beginning, early days, pre and at the commencement of the second Beis Hamikdash, where he invented a concept of muktzah. All muktzah means is set aside. Anything, once again, anything that we assume. Now, Nehemiah's muktzah was a little bit different. What we have is actually a weaker form of muktzah, which goes like this. Anything that we assume that you weren't planning on using on Shabbos is muktzah. You can't utilize on Shabbos. But there's another category of muktzah, which is not about what you are planning on utilizing or not, that Chazal instituted that should be muktzah. Chazal instituted that is off limits. As to why, for example, when it comes to riding an animal, the Gemara gives us a reason. When it comes to muktzah, we have a huge machlokes as to why animals are muktzah. Or Moshe Feinstein even says you shouldn't pet an animal on Shabbos. Typically, you're allowed to touch muktzah, right? You're allowed to touch a car. You're allowed to, you're allowed to touch muktzah. You just can't move muktzah. Or Moshe Feinstein says you can't even touch or pet an animal on Shabbos. The truth is, I've always been against petting. I'm not paskening, petting, because what happens when you pet a dog for a couple of minutes? What's going to be on your hand? What's going to be on your hand? Anyone?
The hair.
Hair. I didn't say it. You said it. I wanted to make sure of that. You said it. You said it. That one of the Halachos of Shabbos is geziza. You're not allowed to pull off hair on Shabbos, and it's guaranteed that's going to happen. So I'm not saying it's forbidden to pet. I'm not saying there isn't a way to pet an animal that it will be a davar shlonos chavid, not a psik reisha. We can come on. It's a shalei nichale. I'm just pointing out. There are a myriad of issues that we need to get through. So milacha, that's for your benefit. Riding on an animal and putting things on an animal, and then the muktzah status of the animal itself. The very next question we have to ask is, by muktzah, generally, there's an idea of setting it aside for use. So, I mean, let's take a rock. In fact, many poskim say that an animal has the status of a rock, in the sense that it's muktzah machmas gufo. It's not a kli, it's not a vessel. So it serves no inherent purpose. So the question is, when I have a pet, so I designate it for a purpose. I play with it. We talk to it. We play fetch. By the way, there's nothing wrong with playing fetch on Shabbos, right? If there's an eruv or I'm in my backyard, and it's not just me, the poskim say this, and I throw a tennis ball and it catches it and it brings it to me, and I take the ball from its mouth. There is no muktzah committed or anything. So we're talking about laying with it, hugging it, holding it, carrying it, and things like that. So it's muktzah, as we said. So people want to argue that, like any other muktzah, when I designate it for use, so let's say I take a rock and I decide my rock's going to be a paperweight or a door stopper, of course, then it's not muktzah anymore. In fact, there are many, you probably have plates and bowls in your home that are made out of rock or marble. They're not muktzah because that rock was designated for a use. So too, people want to claim by a pet. And my wife Nechama makes that argument, and I've heard this from poskim as well. In my view, personally, I'm just going to be honest with you, I find that to be untenable for two reasons. Number one is, not all poskim agree, that it's not a universal opinion that animals are muktzah machmas gufo. Some suggest they're just decreed. It's an injunction of the rabbis put into the category of muktzah that pets are muktzah. It's without a category. But let's even assume that they fall under non-utensil things like twigs or rocks. And then my wife's argument seems very reasonable. If you set it aside for a use, they're like a twig. There are many things in your house made of wood. We don't say it's muktzah. It started off as a twig. We designated it before Shabbos. My pet was designated for use before Shabbos. The problem with that is, and I think I even mentioned this in the muktzah share a couple of years ago, is if you remember in the 1970s, there was if you remember, I wasn't around, but I've read about it. I've seen YouTube videos, which I can't, someone's here. Hold on one second. I'm sorry. 1 second. There's something called a pet rock. Does anybody remember pet rocks?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Someone remembers. So I guess this only happened in the 70s. Some genius came up with this. It must have been a Jew who said, "I'm going to take rocks. I'm going to buy infomercials on TV at 1 a.m. and for like $100, you're going to order a rock. It's going to be a pet rock." And it was a craze. Kids, teenagers were spending a fortune on pet rocks. It sounds crazy, like the Cabbage Patch dolls of the 80s, which at least made a little bit of sense. It was a doll. These were just rocks in the mail. So let me ask you a question. If rocks are muktzah on Shabbos, but if I designate it to be a paperweight or a vessel before Shabbos, a door stopper, it's not muktzah anymore, correct? Correct. So what about a pet rock? If I have a rock in my backyard, it's Friday morning, and I say, I don't want this rock to be muktzah. So my wife says, "Why don't you make it a door stopper?" And I say, no, I'm going to make it a pet. Did I just designate it for use on Shabbos? Of course not. You're not using it for a utensil. So even if, we don't know why, but even if the rabbis, when they made pets muktzah on Shabbos, put it in the status of like a rock, you're still not utilizing it for a kli, a vessel, or a specific purpose. I just don't get what you're doing. Now, are there poskim who say, no, certainly by a seeing eye dog, So a seeing eye dog actually serves a direct vessel-like purpose. Without it, you can't get around. It's actually doing a service for you. In that case, we will rely on the opinions that a pet's like a rock, and then say you're designating it for our use before Shabbos. But if it's just, you enjoy your pet, that's not a use. However, there are those that say two steps. It's a minority, I'm being honest with you, a great minority, but there are those that say, hey, if this dog is an emotional help for you, you need it emotionally. And in fact, if anybody would ask me and say that emotionally, this gives me a great calm. And not, anybody who has a pet, your pet gives you great calm. I mean, someone who really needs it in their life. Today there's something called an emotional support animal, right? It used to be when I was growing up, when you would check in your bags, people would check in their dogs and cats. Today, not only on the plane do you see emotional support dogs. I mean, you could see emotional support peacocks. People come onto the plane with the weirdest animals, but that is a concept in Halacha. If someone really needs it, so then now you could be a little bit more lenient. And now what about someone who just has a pet that they love? A parakeet, a dog, a cat. They're not going to lie to the rabbi. It doesn't give me, of course, and it makes me happy, but it's not like without it, I'm depressed, or I suffer from depression, I should say. Of course, if the animal leaves, you'll be depressed. I suffer from depression, and this helps me like Prozac. It's just, I love my dog. Are there any rabbis who let? A couple. There are many who claim Moshe Feinstein allows this. He absolutely does not, in my opinion. It is a complete misreading of his tshuva. In fact, in many places, he states very clearly, not only are pets muktzah, but he says he's the one who introduces us to the idea that you can't even pet your pet on Shabbos. So the idea that he would allow such a thing is just not true. So I'm giving you information. I'm not paskening tonight. I'm just telling you the starting point is all pets are muktzah. You're not, in fact, the Shulchan Aruch tells us that you're allowed to push it. And if it's stuck or something, you could lift it by the scruff of its neck. But that's it. That's really all you can do on Shabbos. Now, if an animal is in tsar, if your pet, or even not your pet, is stuck in a fence, of course, for tsar by chayim will allow certain things to be done. We'll get to that another time. But we're talking generally speaking. So that's without complexities. Everything I just said now is the basic halacha, very basic halacha. I saw tonight from the Ber Moshe who writes, because I was looking around, does anybody explicitly state that these Gemaras don't apply to pets? We all think we're so special, but we're not. There were pets in the days of the Gemara. So I don't buy the whole, it's a new time argument. I find that to be very dangerous because it's not new pets. It's just not. But I looked, and the Ber Moshe says, Eimaz nichem osam, that people who are lenient this way, you don't yell at them, which is what we do. Maybe that's why rabbis don't get up and scream about it. But the basic halacha, at least be aware of it. But this is only the beginning of our problems. So before I move on, just to quickly review what we just said, you can't ride, you can't put things on it, you can't do malacha with it, and you can't touch it, they're muktzah. A seeing eye dog, which is actually designated for a direct purpose, a usage, would be allowed to be moved on Shabbos. It's not considered muktzah. Just playing with your pet, most poskim would say that's not okay. However, if someone does it, we don't say anything because maybe they have what to rely on. It's that space in between an emotional support animal, which if someone would come to me and I would talk to them and they're asking a shayla, like on a fast day, could I break my fast? I probably, if it's really true, not because you can't rule on this on your own, but you need an objective voice because we all love our pets. So it's good to go to a rabbi or maybe even your spouse and say, do you think this is an emotional support animal? And if it is, then maybe you have what to rely on. But again, you're going against the Chazal. Now, I shouldn't say going against. There is a very basic rule in Chazal that you're trying to get out of. It's like breaking a fast, which is also D'Rabbanan, right? Next week is Shavas B'Tammuz. Being allowed to eat on Shavas B'Tammuz is no different than playing with your pet. It may be allowed. There are many people who are not going to fast this Sunday. And there are many people who are going to play with the pets on Shabbos. I hope in both those cases they spoke to a Rav. Okay, so I got that off my chest. I'm sorry. Don't be upset if you play with your animals on Shabbos. I don't judge you. My own children don't listen to me on this matter. which is the way it should be. My wife disagrees with me on all of this. So maybe you should ask Nechama the Shaila, because she understands this halacha differently, and she's fine enough to rely on. You could speak to her. She feels that a pet that relies on you, I mean, if she's on here, I don't know, is she going to unmute herself? Is she on here? Yeah, she is. I don't know if she's going to unmute herself. I think she says two things. Number one is that A, you're designating it before Shabbos, and B, a pet is not just relying on you for food. A pet is relying on you for love and comfort. That sounds great, but this is not a Carblach song. Please, what do you mean? Your cat doesn't care if you hug it. It's not a child. But that being said, the differences between men and women. But what do I know? I never had a pet in my life. Okay. I always joke that if we would ever get a dog in my house, I just know what's going to happen. The dog's going to look at me and fall in love with me, and I'm going to have to walk it every day. I could just imagine the nekama Kadosh Baruch Hu will have on me. But we're just getting started. And we'll go on for a few more minutes. We may have to have a part 3. And these are so important. Isn't it sad? People go through lives. So many of these classes on Shabbos that people don't review. And this is so important that we're reviewing. So important. Remember I mentioned that if I would have mentioned pets, if this course or series of shiurim would have taken its natural course, we would have waited for the malach of trapping, Seidah. And that's because another very common problem with pets is trapping. Think about it. We all know that trapping is forbidden. Now, there are 39 malachas. Most people can name 7, maybe, because we don't live in a world where we deal with all those other malachos. I always think of the Gemara of Acher. The Gemara tells us there were 4 people who entered Pardes, the great secret of the world and the deepest mystical elements of Kabbalah. And Rabbi Akiva was the only one who left unscathed. And Acher, of course, left Torah Judaism. He just couldn't handle what he saw in that secret garden. And he went to a prostitute. And the prostitute says to him, the Zona says, "Aren't you the famous Rav?" Yeah, I can't believe it's you. Like you're a cop, right? Like this is all a setup. So what did he do, Acher, to prove that he left Torah Judaism? It happened to be Shabbos. He bent down and he ripped out grass or things growing from the ground. And she said, "Oh, you must not care about Judaism anymore." To me, what was amazing about that Gemara is, if you wanted to prove to a non-Jew you weren't religious, pulling out grass on Shabbos, they will look at you like you're crazy. Because we don't associate that in our world, driving, maybe smoking a cigarette. In each generation, there are different malachos we associate with Shabbos. So, 100 years ago, trapping was a rabbi would give a shir on Shabbos. The first thing he would talk about was trapping. People had farms. But just like lighting a fire on Shabbos and cooking on Shabbos, or in the days of Acher, pulling out grass if you were a farmer, so too is trapping prohibited on Shabbos with all the complexities, which includes closing the door when you have an animal inside. Remember when I was a kid, the first time I learned about trapping, I don't remember how it came up, but it was on Shabbos. I was like 15 and I was in yeshiva. We had a yeshiva Shabbos. We were locking, we stuck someone in a closet, I think. I'm sure I wasn't. I was probably telling them, let him go. Probably not what happened. But anyway, the Rebbe came in and said, not only is it disgusting what you're doing, but it's a violation of Shabbos law because you're trapping a live being on Shabbos. It's an amazing thought, right? Because you don't think about the application, because we only think about the 7 malachos, carrying, borer, the classic malachos in 2022. So what you need to know is this is not a problem for pets on Shabbos. I don't want to get you too nervous. If a cat or a dog is, and I'm not mentioning reptiles because we'll talk about that in a moment, or fish because we'll talk about that in a moment, time allowing. If it's domesticated, there's no prohibition of closing the door behind it. The problem you get into is if it's not domesticated. You ever see there are people who have these wild dogs, and even though they've owned this dog for 5 years, they're walking the street, they're holding it for dear life. That is absolutely tzeidah. Even taking it for a walk is trapping because you have it on a leash. And closing the door on it will be a tzeidah on Shabbos. A new pet. A borrowed pet, your from neighbor goes on vacation and gives you its dog, and the dog is not yet comfortable in your home. And if you left the door open, you would be afraid that it might leave. You're not allowed to close your door the whole Shabbos, or don't own pets on Shabbos. I hope Nechama hears this. This is why we can't own a pet, because the first 2 weeks, it's going to be a problem. Now, I'm not saying there isn't a way that, you could figure this out. Maybe buy a pet on a Sunday, and maybe buy a pet when it's very young. So it gets, by domesticated, I mean it's comfortable in its environment. It knows where it's living. And that maybe, I don't know, maybe that could happen before the first Shabbos. But the very first and second, third, fourth Shabbos, you have a serious problem of trapping on Shabbos. And then you think about a smaller animal. My sister-in-law has a bird. I think it's a parakeet. Nechama, I see you're on. I hope you unmute yourself. What type of bird? She's not going to mute herself. I don't know what type of bird it is, but it was alive since the day I got married. I think it died last year. And
It's a cockatiel.
Okay, I don't know what that is, but it's a cockatiel. And it was my sister-in-law. There was a time, Nechama, you remember this, when it was healthy. She would walk around, my sister-in-law, in her house on the phone with the bird on her shoulder. Just
she's on the share too, so she could correct you.
Brachi's on the shear?
Yep.
Oh, Brachi? Did it die?
Yes, it did.
Oh, you sounded like the bird just now. The
A few weeks ago.
Baruch Dayan Emes. If you were by last year, we discussed about Berachs and etc. So in that case, it's by such a bird, at least at the very beginning, it's so problematic. Brachi, were the wings clipped?
Nope.
You're dealing with problems because now you're putting something in a very confined space. So if you leave it in there on Shabbos, it's fine. But if you take it out on Shabbos, even if it flies back on its own, because it probably just knows that's where it goes for food, closing that cage door could be an act of tzeda. Now, it often is not with the bird, especially if its wings are clipped, or if it's not a fly. I don't know about that bird that we just mentioned, if it's a flying bird. But you may have to, in certain instances, keep the cage open on Shabbos if you open it. Meaning, if you go into Shabbos with it closed, don't open it. But once you open it, you may have to keep it open. Why then are you allowed to, if you have a bird at home, leave your house? Meaning, once I open the door to go to shul, when I close the door, now I'm trapping the bird into the house. The answer is, so long as the bird is in a space where I can't catch it in one jump, meaning it can fly around, even my office here in shul is not considered being trapped. So if it was flying, if a pet bird of mine was flying around this office, I'm allowed to open my door and close it. But a cage is very problematic. And then it gets even deeper. The cage itself is muktzah. Because if the bird is muktzah, in my view, again, maybe not Nechama's view, but in my view, if the cage is muktzah, then the birdhouse is muktzah. The doghouse is muktzah. The litter box is for sure muktzah. It's so funny because I wanted to open with this. I forgot. So last week, we the whole reason we stumbled into this topic, because this is not really our topic, is because of the dog Nechama found. Last Shabbos, I go outside to set up for the kids. So we had the abortion shear. I was about to say we had the abortion last Shabbos. We had the abortion shear. And right before that, we had the kids coming to my house. Everything was very quick. So 10 minutes before the kids came over, I ran outside. And Nisanel followed me outside to play. Also, like a pet, he knows what's coming next, ices. So he went out, and I'm setting up the chips. And Nisanel says, "Ew, there's a dead, what was it? Raccoon? What was it, Nechama? Nechama, are you there?" Oh, she's not there now. But I think it was a raccoon. There was a dead chipmunk just laying in my backyard. And I was thinking to myself, this is amazing, because now I have something else to talk about pets or animals on Shabbos, because Nechama asked, are you allowed to move the dead? Let me ask you, the audience, we have to end already.
It was a squirrel.
A squirrel. If Nisanel was here, Nechama, he could explain the difference between a chipmunk and a squirrel. I mean, chipmunks put out CDs and records. I know that. That's one difference. But I don't know the animalistic difference. So
Most people could tell the difference between a squirrel and a chipmunk.
really, I can't. I could barely tell the difference between a rat and a chipmunk. So yes, the answer is you can move a dead mouse the same way you can move dirty diapers, even though they're no greater muktzah than that. Something that smells and it's disgusting, you can move. In fact, Chazal say you don't even have to do it with a shinoi. You don't have to do it in an indirect manner. Maybe the parents shouldn't know that there was a dead squirrel in our backyard before your kids were playing there. But in any event, this is just the beginning of pets and animals on Shabbos. Next week, we're going to continue this topic. There's still a lot more to say. I also want to review a lot more. I want to share my screen. This is the first week in a long time I didn't share my screen and show you certain articles and items and Shuvas and Shulchan Aruchs. But what I do want to do next week is show you some of the Gemaras inside. And I want to take you on that journey from the Gemara to the final halacha. So when you finish the shir and you repeat it, what you're not to say is, Rabbi Tab gave a shir and you're really not allowed to touch pets on Shabbos. We've been doing it wrong. What you should say is it's more complicated than I thought. It's more complicated than I thought. And I want to just end with one final example, actually two final examples very quickly. The first example is when you give your pet to a neighbor, even a non-Jewish neighbor, I want you to listen closely. You go on vacation and you give your pet to a non-Jewish neighbor, you better tell that non-Jewish neighbor that this pet can keep Shabbos. This pet cannot do malacha on Shabbos. So often people for Pesach, they give their pets to a guy. Now, first of all, you shouldn't give your pets to a guy. You should sell it to a guy because maybe you can't find animal feed that's kosher Pesach. But on Pesach, your animal can't do malacha. And these are things you have to be aware of. And that's why it's so important that I'm sharing this with you. Even though there are many ways of getting around these issues, you have to be aware of this. But the last thing I want to share with you is I have a friend of mine, Yitz Feldheim. He's been in care of Kirov outreach for many, many years. So we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and he shared with me this idea. It's his own idea. I thought it was interesting. He said, just an idea, we always like to say something philosophical at the beginning or the end. So I'll end with this. We talked last week about Kelev, a dog. And we talked about Kayin and Chafetz Chaim, about the loyalty of a dog and how Jews have owned dogs for many centuries, and that the pasuk tells us we were saved in Mitzrayim from a dog and from dogs, and we give nevela and shrefa to a dog. And he said something fascinating. He said that the pasuk tells us that you're not allowed to use for a sacrifice money that was exchanged for two things. Does anybody know what those two things are? What monies can't be used for a sacrifice? Come on, someone has to know this. It's such a small crowd. It's a Tuesday night. Come on.
Avodah Zarah.
No. I mean, yes, but the Zarah can't be utilized for anything. Now, the two things are a kelev, money used in exchange of a dog, and this is a pasuk, and money used in exchange for a zona for sexual favors. That's the pasuk. So there's a beautiful chiddush. What do they have in common? Like, of all things in the world, these two things. So in life, there are certain things that are synthetic, or what's the word? Simulation. Love could be simulated. So what is love? True ahava, we know, is a give and take, right? The parents give, the children take. That's why we always say parents love children more than children love parents, because ahav, to love is to give. By the way, I just want to remind you, there's another reason why children don't love parents as much as parents love their kids. Everything we have is from Adam and Chava, and Adam and Chava never had parents. So it's not in our DNA to love parents, because we never had parents historically, initially when we began. But leaving that aside, so between spouses, right? If there's a give and take, and if you're a taker as a spouse, you're not going to feel love. And if you're just a giver, you're not going to feel love. A kalev and a zona represent both ends of synthetic love. So a kelev is kilev. It's like a heart, because people love their pets. And the love that you have for your little cockapoo, it doesn't feel for you. I mean, there's always these stories in the news of a dog calling 911. It's in the news because it's so bizarre. And your dog likes you, but really it just loves you because you give it food. And that's how you train it, by the way. You don't train it from, you pet it, you train it from giving it food. When you go to SeaWorld, they don't give the Shamu a hug, they give Shamu a fish after it jumps. So that's one type of synthetic love where you're giving it love, but you're not really getting love in return. You're not getting sacrifice in return. And a zona, the trading sexual favors is the same way, where it's the opposite. You're getting love, right? She's giving you love, but you don't give it anything in return. You give it money, you give her money, but you're not really giving true ahava. I thought that's a beautiful point. And what does carbon come from? It comes from the root of lekarev, to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's the relationship we want with Hashem, a true relationship, not that of a kalev where it's only one way. I'm showing my love to Hashem, but I don't have anything in return. And not lahavdil netzach, like a zona where HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives us something which is unearned and undeserved and doesn't come out of ahava. We want the relationship to be real. And part of our relationship being real is that we should have pets and we should love Hashem's creations, but we should do so in a manner that is fitting according to halacha, so we could be Shomer Shabbos, we could be guardians of Shabbos for generations and generations to come. To be continued next week, everybody. Have a good week. I'm sorry for the early share. And for those watching on recording, which I know are most of you, I apologize for the late notice and the switch of the day. We'll continue with part 3 next week. Have a good week, everybody.